All right, everybody. I know some more folks will probably be trickling in over the next few minutes, but we have so much we want to cover today with everybody, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Yeah, we're really excited everyone's here with us today. Thanks for joining us. My name is Ella Banerjee, and I'm the Community Partnership Manager at Voice of Witness. As we're starting to settle in and going to jump into our conversation, I just want to share a couple workshop norms for our time together over Zoom. So first, we encourage you to take a moment to introduce yourselves in the chat. Feel free to share your name, if you're part of any particular school or organizations you might want to share, and as well as sharing what land you're calling from. If you're not sure of which Indigenous land you're on, you can go to native-land.ca to find out more info. It's a really great resource if folks haven't heard about it. We also encourage you to use the chat box throughout the event today to engage with each other and share any thoughts or reflections you might have throughout the event. You can also ask questions in the chat, or you can directly, direct message them to me, and we'll hold on to those questions and keep an eye on them for the Q&A section that we're going to have at the end after our conversation between Dao and Fanny. And I just want to ask folks to make sure that your display name in Zoom right now matches the name that you use to register for the workshop. That helps us just keep track of, who's able to join us for the event. And if you do want to use or enable automated captions, you can turn them off. You can turn them on rather in the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom window. Feel free to DM me also if you have any questions with that. All right. So I know that we have some folks here who already are familiar with Voice of Witness. So I'm seeing some familiar faces and names, and also some new folks, which is really exciting. So I just want to give a little bit of background about us, our organization, Voice of Witness, in case some folks are meeting us for the first time today or still getting to know us. So Voice of Witness, also known as VOW, is an oral history nonprofit. Our mission is to advance human rights by amplifying the stories of people impacted by and the people fighting against injustice through oral history, education, and advocacy. In our programming and our partnerships, we work with communities to document and center unheard voices. We teach ethics-driven storytelling, and we develop different educational resources. One of our key programs is our oral history book series, in which each of our books focuses on a different human rights issue and shares first-person narratives from people who've been directly impacted by the issue. We have over 20 books in our series right now, including a new one called Beginning Again, which is focused on migration and resettlement in the Appalachia region, which is going to be coming out this June on World Refugee Day. So just a shout out to that book and encourage you to keep your eyes peeled for it. We also have an education program at VAL as well, which brings free curriculum and other resources to teach oral history and important social issues to classrooms across the country. And we also develop community partnerships with many different types of organizations and individuals in order to support them in their own oral history storytelling work. So that's just a little bit about us at Voice of Witness. We're really excited for today because today kicks off our new Oral History in Practice event series. So in these conversations, all us at VOW are going to be talking to individual oral history practitioners who are currently working on really interesting and really important community-rooted storytelling projects. So we're hoping that these conversations will be a chance for all of us to not only learn more about these projects and listen to some of the powerful excerpts and recordings from them, but to really explore together the connection between oral history and community, and how we can use storytelling to deepen advocacy, to enhance representation, to work on relationship building, narrative chains, and a whole host of other things. Plus, all these individuals who are having these conversations with are close collaborators within the VOW community, and we just really love them and love talking to them, and we think that you all will love listening and talking to them too. So our first conversation today will be focused on the Oral History Project Separated, Stories of Injustice and Solidarity. So we're going to have in conversation Dao Tran and Fanny García, and I'm just going to do a quick intro for them right now. So Dao Tran is the editorial director at Voice of Witness and formerly a senior editor at Haymarket Books. When not collaborating on and marking up manuscripts or scouting projects and partnerships, Dao is raising a spirited teenager and a feisty terrier mixed doggo. And I'll give Dao a chance to say hi and to share where you're calling from. Oh, I think you're on mute, Dao.
Sorry, thought I hit it. Hi, I'm calling from Lenape and Canarsie land in Brooklyn. And you'll see my terrier possibly making an appearance, and also a foster dog who's with me.
Thanks, Dao. And we're so excited today that our first guest in this oral history and practice series is Fanny Garcia. Fanny is an award-winning Honduran-American oral historian, contributing work to Central American studies. She is a renowned public speaker on applied oral history, the art and craft of interviewing and storytelling. She graduated with a bachelor's from UCLA and a master's degree in oral history from Columbia University. Fanny is the project director for Separated, which documents the stories of families separated under the Trump administration's zero tolerance policy, and is the project that we're going to be talking about more today. So I'll give Fanny a chance to say hi and to call and to share where you're calling in from also.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And I am in Lenape-Hoekingland, Harlem, New York City.
Thanks, Fanny. And I'm actually going to pass it over to you, Fanny, to introduce the project before you and Dao dive into a conversation together.
Awesome. Thank you, Ella. So I've written up a brief summary about what the project is and what we've been doing. So in the summer of 2018, news broke that the Trump administration had adopted a radical new policy to deter people from crossing the border and prevent them from applying for asylum. The policy was separating children from their parents. Word of the policy provoked outrage and galvanized tens of thousands of people around the country and even the world to take to the streets. And within weeks, the administration rescinded the policy, but the damage was done. Thousands of children had been taken from their parents, and hundreds and some parents had then also been deported back to their country of origin. Separated, Stories of Injustice and Solidarity documents this historic human rights violation. It records the stories of mothers and fathers, daughters and sons, to ensure their stories of resistance and solidarity is not forgotten. Since 2020, the project has interviewed about 40 parents and 8 children who experienced separation under zero tolerance. And in 2022, we also had the opportunity to interview 13 human rights workers who are from Central America and Mexico and worked to find the parents after they had been deported without their children. And we documented their stories about that search for the parents. Beyond archiving the stories for posterity, though, the project further seeks to bring them into the public conversation in the present. Developed in collaboration not only with advocacy organizations, but also with family members themselves, Separated serves as a platform for families who have experienced separation to transform injustice into action. And the goal for the project has always been to deploy and mobilize excerpts from the oral histories to support policy and advocacy efforts on behalf of the families impacted by family separation. For example, since the project began, we've written and published an op-ed in the Washington Post. We have submitted audio excerpts from the oral histories to a meeting with Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. And the oral histories have also served as qualitative data in policy briefs about the impact of family separation on parents and children, all in an effort to advocate for restitution for families impacted by this human rights violation. I think one of the most significant mobilizations of the oral histories happened in January 2022, when we used the excerpts from the oral histories to respond to a call for public comment from DHS on behalf of the White House's Task Force on Family Reunification. I first asked the families if they wanted to respond to the call for public comment. Then I went into the transcription of the oral histories and excerpted sections to create a brief narrative. Then I read the excerpt back to the parent or the child to make sure they approved what we had excerpted to share for the public. And through this process, we successfully created about 9 narratives and submitted them for public comment. And I want to read you just one of them, and we'll share the link to the original, which was submitted to a website, and you can read it. And if you speak Spanish, you'll be able to read it. I'm going to read the version in English. I'm going to read the first 4 lines in Spanish to acknowledge the language that we used when I had conversations, and actually the language that we used for all of the families that we interviewed for this project. The father who decided to submit this excerpt and narrative anonymously says in Spanish, "Yo soy padre guatemalteco. A mí me quitaron a mi hija, que tenía solo 3 años cuando me separaron de ella, y se la llevaron a una casa hogar. Era tan pequeña que la llevaba cargada en mis brazos cuando me la quitaron. Ella estaba llorando mucho, y yo no pude hacer nada. Porque ¿qué voy a hacer yo? No podía hacer nada. I am a Guatemalan father. My daughter, who is only 3 years old, was taken from me when they separated me from her and took her to a group home. She was so small that I carried her in my arms. When they took her from me, she was crying so much, and there was nothing I could do. What could I do? They took my daughter from me, and I couldn't do anything. They took her from me. She was only 3 years old."
I think you were muted, Fanny, the last 30 seconds, if you can unmute, sorry.
Okay, I'm gonna go back. I think it was around, I'm not sure where it muted me, so I'll just start. There was nothing I could do. What could I do? They took my daughter from me. I couldn't do anything. They took her from me. She was only 3 years old. She was so little. I was in jail for 50 days. They punished me for 50 days. I was alone. They didn't tell me anything. I asked about my daughter, about everything, and no information. The immigration people don't want to talk to you. I wanted to talk, but I couldn't do anything because I didn't have any money and I didn't understand Spanish very well. We speak the Quiche language. Me and my daughter speak the Quiche language because in my village, all the people only speak Quiche. Yes, there are some who understand a little Spanish, but most of my people understand almost no Spanish at all. They only speak Quiche. That's why I couldn't do anything and didn't understand anything. I was separated from my daughter and I was deported after 50 days. I felt very sad and powerless. Yes, I remember everything very well. I never saw my daughter again. She was crying a lot because she didn't know Spanish. She didn't understand anything. She was crying a lot and she was hugging me. And then the immigration agent shouted at me, "Shut up! Why did you come here with your daughter?" When they took her away, I spent 50 days crying. I could not eat well, and everything was very sad because of the separation from my daughter. Yes, I was very afraid and worried about my daughter. I was scared because there are people there who have been in jail for 20 years. And when you get there, it scares you because I have never been in jail. I recommend to the US government not to separate families because this causes a lot of sadness and pain and trauma to the parents and especially to the children. I also recommend that they add more people who speak other languages such as Quiche for families like mine who do not speak and understand Spanish very well. The separation of children causes a lot of sadness.
Thank you so much, Fanny, for sharing that. Perhaps we can start kind of at the beginning. I feel like I've been talking to you about this project for quite some time now, and I know the kind of origin story, but maybe you can share with everyone, how did the project come to be? And why do you feel like oral history was the medium or the structure for the project?
Well, the project was from the beginning developed in partnership. When I say we, it's because I wasn't alone in crafting this project. I partnered with my friend and colleague, Nara Milanic, who's a history professor at Barnard College. And after that initial partnership, the Oral History Association provided us with the initial funding for this project. In 2019, I applied for a grant called the Emerging Crises Grant. And I think this is really important to mention because oral history does not and cannot survive in isolation. It needs support from people and communities and institutions. It needs heart and it needs funding. And so the project would not have taken off if it hadn't been for that support that we received in the beginning. And then it merged into the organization Women's Refugee Commission hired me in 2020 to create for them a storytelling project. And the premise of that project was to document the stories of families who were migrating to the US. But because of my interest in family separation and the need, we decided to record through that collaboration and partnership the stories of families who had been separated. We interviewed a few of others who had been impacted by other policies, like Remain in Mexico policy. But this became the central focus. And through that partnership, that initial partnership with Women's Refugee Commission, we interviewed 26 families that had been separated. And we also connected with an amazing organization called Justice in Motion. And Justice in Motion, I got to tell you, was instrumental in connecting us to families that had been sent back to their countries without their children, because outside of the jurisdiction of the US, those families might not have been able to access justice about what had happened to them. And so they connected us to those families because they felt that if no justice can be served through legal means, perhaps in the process of telling their story, they will have an opportunity to voice the injustice that had happened to them. And so, that's how it first began, just in collaboration with people trusting us, with families trusting us. I felt it was also really important to collaborate with organizations like Women's Refugee Commission and Justice in Motion, because they were part of the steering committee established by the ACLU through a lawsuit that they filed against the government. On behalf of families, a class action lawsuit. And so these organizations were already in touch with families. If I had cold called the families and told them, "Hi, I'm Fanny, I want to document your story," they wouldn't have really, they already, even though I was connected with these organizations, they already doubted. They were scared that this was fraud or that somebody was trying to extort them or that I was part of immigration. And so being connected to organizations that were already working with migrants was super helpful in helping us establish trust. As to the question about why oral histories, I think oral history is one of the few fields in which the narrator or the person that is interviewed can exercise their agency, be clear about their motive, about why they're telling their story, and use it and use their voice for something, for change, to get the word out about something, and to subvert the idea that the common person doesn't get to be recorded or doesn't merit recording and documenting. The families were very clear. And when I first started speaking with them, they told me, I'm telling you my story because I want you to do something with it. And here's what I want you to do. Even in that short excerpt, the parent said, you know, I'm submitting this because I want you to make sure that you have more Spanish speakers at the border or people who speak Quiche, you know, like exercising why is important. Someone's not just going to tell their story for the hell of it. There has to be a reason. And so I think oral history provides space for nurturing, cultivating that agency and resilience.
Thank you for sharing all of that. I feel like I have so many follow-up questions, and I'm also trying to stick to our time limitations. But one of the, you know, when you were reading the excerpt, the interview took place in Spanish, even though, as he mentioned, he's a Quiche speaker. And, you know, I feel like you probably had a dozen different ethical considerations like that, but maybe just talk us through what that particular one was and where you ended up. And then also maybe other ones that you had. I feel like there's a lot to unpack there, and also curious, you know, in all of the oral history projects that we work on, feel like that there's a key quest for discovery, right? There's always something surprising. So I'm curious if there were surprising elements that became clearer to you as you worked on the project.
Yes. One other thing that I forgot to mention why it was important to use oral history is because the majority of these interviews have been done over the phone. Because in the beginning, families were deported back to their country. So I was calling them from my home in New York City and reaching them in Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras. So I couldn't send equipment to them. I had to record their voices. And so that was I was limited, but also it allowed me to really focus on the person's voice. Language, we soon discovered, was going to be a challenge for many reasons. You should know that the majority of families that were separated were from Guatemala. Guatemala is known as a country where many indigenous populations have lived for thousands of years. And so, there's like something like 240 different languages and dialects from Guatemala. And so I immediately noticed my Spanish to be insufficient, to be super vulnerable and clear and direct about that. I was born in Honduras. I was raised in Mexico, and I am a native speaker. But, you know, Guatemalan Spanish is different than Honduran Spanish. And then add to that Spanglish, right? And so there were a lot of challenges with it. But because of the trust I had with families, and that they imparted on me, we navigated in the language that they felt comfortable. And if I ever felt that somebody was not at all comfortable with Spanish or that they preferred Quiche, I would tell them, we won't be able to do an interview, but let's stay in touch. And this is why I say that funding for oral histories is important. And funding for oral histories is important because language can exclude some people from being recorded or documented. And so, those were all like ethical considerations that I had to think about when I was interviewing families. Yeah, I don't know. I have much more to say about it, but in short, we didn't have funding to hire somebody that was Quiché speaking or Calquiché speaking. So I did the best I could with my language skills and asking the families, are you comfortable enough with Spanish to speak with me? And if not, we can see, find other alternatives or try to find something that works for you.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Do you want to talk about some of the other ethical considerations? I think, here of trauma being such a key part of these conversations, while you don't, I would think that you didn't want to just talk about those issues and incidents, because, you're coming from a place that's much more holistic, but also has to think about what to do around a conversation that is going to touch on trauma points. How did you deal with that? The question of, accountability to your narrators, the question of compensation. I feel like there's a lot. You can pick and choose. I don't know, it's a lot.
Yeah, families, I learned I had to prepare myself really well for trauma-informed interviewing and the different types of traumas that families were experiencing all at the same time while speaking with me. The family separation and the separation from the children triggered a lot of other traumas in their lives. Many of the families that we interviewed were the children or grandchildren of people who had experienced genocide or massacre in Guatemala, for example, or were experiencing displacement due to climate change or hydroelectric dams and other kind of corporate infringement on their lands. And so I had to educate myself on all of those and find out what the best approach was to understand them. I was also kind of restricted because I wasn't seeing somebody. I couldn't console somebody with facial features, which we do when we exchange, when we have a dialogic exchange with a person. I could only use my voice and verbally acknowledge what they were telling me. And so in the interviews, you will hear me acknowledge that I can hear their throat clenching because they're trying to hold back tears. And I would ask, what's happening? What are you feeling right now? And they would tell me. And that was the only way that I could see what was happening on the other end of the line. Also, these interviews started in the middle of a global pandemic. And so families were experiencing that as well. So there was a lot of consideration for both narrator and myself, because I was hearing these stories. I was working a 9-to-5 job in something that's not related to oral history, shutting down my computer from that work and turning it back up so that I could do the oral histories with families. And so it was a lot to manage, but it required a lot of care and intention. And then I would check in with families all the time afterwards. One thing that we developed that was super helpful is something that I call a dynamic verbal consent. Ongoing dynamic verbal consent, because I couldn't send paperwork for families to sign, number one. Two, many families had different educational levels. So some didn't really have the ability to write their name, even if I could send them a consent form. Irregular access to Wi-Fi, irregular access to a smartphone. So all of those things complicated my ability to do what we are taught, which is like a formal consent process. So I had to adapt, I had to pivot. And what I did was create an ongoing verbal consent that was dynamic. And I call it dynamic because it changed per person. And it changed per person because there was a question that I asked each time, which is, why do you want to participate in this? Why do you want to talk to me? and we recorded that as part of the interview. And then another big consideration was compensating people for documenting their story, for talking with us. And we did that because narrators taught us that they were experiencing hardship. Some people had mortgaged their house to be able to have enough funds to come to the US with their children. They had been detained for months at end without being able to work. So they were in profound debt when they were deported back without their children, in depression. And so we couldn't ethically go into these conversations and say, please tell me your story, and not acknowledge that. And so we paid all of our narrators. We compensated them for the pre-interview and the recorded interview, and we kept in touch. It wasn't just about the compensation, it was checking in after the call. Are you okay? How are you feeling? How did you feel after talking to me? To try to mitigate that shame backwash when it happens to all of us, you know, whether you're a professional or not, or a regular person. When you talk to somebody, we overthink what we said. And so that can happen in an oral history interview. And so I would check in with them to make sure they were all right afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's striking hearing you talk about all of this is just how much care and intention went into the project planning, execution, all of it, and also how much of the work is so deeply relational. And I think it's evident that that's the place ethically from which you start. That's the thread that kind of is woven throughout the whole project. So
Yeah.
there's lots more. Maybe people will have questions to follow up with in the discussion part. But just to move a little bit into another question, I'm curious if you can talk about, you know, it's obvious that the main motivation of many of your narrators was to contribute to advocacy efforts for their own rights and for the rights of others like them. How do you see that playing out in the work that the project and you and the narrators have done? And more broadly, can you talk a little bit about, you know, we're hearing a lot about this notion of narrative change. And I mean, I think at root, this is about contributing to the kinds of stories that aren't heard enough, the kinds of people who are not interviewed in the news stories and are not featured. And that to me is about, you know, connecting to this notion of narrative change. How do you see the project working, you know, toward that goal?
Yeah, relational practice has been at the center of this work, not just with narrators, but again, with organizations that are at the forefront of responding to immigration injustice. And so, because the goal has always been for that to mobilize the oral histories, we've gone through, we wrote a narrative initiative article, for example. The narrative initiative article, I'm super proud of it, not just because I wrote it, but because I don't know why I'm getting emotional, but I was 10 years old when I came to the US, and I remember being so excited about coming to the US, about contributing, about learning English, about consuming everything that was American. But quickly in my teens, when I was in high school, I realized that a lot of people didn't feel that I belonged here. And one of the things that happened when I was a teen growing up in California was Prop 187. Prop 187 was a proposition brought by local officials that was going to exclude undocumented people from accessing education and healthcare. And I was a teen in high school at the time, and that made me really afraid. But people mobilized, undocumented people mobilized, and even though the proposition passed, they mobilized so much that it ended up getting rescinded later on in the courts. And so I strongly believe that stories can impact people and make change. And I believe these oral histories from families that were separated will make sure that we don't forget, and maybe also that we remind ourselves that family separation is part and parcel of the founding of this country. This family separation is nothing new. Enslaved people, African American enslaved people were separated from each other as a way to disrupt their familial ties. Indigenous people were also separated from their families when they were placed in boarding homes. And so I believe that if we keep at it, we can do something, we can make change. And so that narrative initiative article was from the point of view of the families and their resilience and agency, and truly their anger that this had happened to them. And the focus was not to see them as supplicants or victims, not just to see them as that, but to see them as people who are teaching us about how to make our democracy better. And so I think that that's where oral history can really help craft narrative change. I'll say something really quickly about the fact that we're in a presidential election cycle. Under Biden, the immigration officials have continued to separate families. And he's considering employing executive power to prevent people from crossing the border and exercising their right to claim asylum. So we need to mobilize these stories because they're telling us something about how we can be better, how we can stop excluding. Yeah, I'll stop there. I can say so much more.
We'll be having more conversation. But you know, the connection, I mean, there's two things that I'm thinking of. The connection that you raised to democracy, so important, and to this really long legacy, which is foundational to this country, of family separation, that it's not just existing at the southern border. It's not just a one-time policy question. And for that reason, you know, it's even more important that we hear directly from the people who are most impacted. I feel like we could keep talking about this, but I really love the fact, you know, I've seen some of the other stories, listened to a few of them. The fact that you don't just focus on the injustice, but that you try to give people a sense of their ability to represent themselves in a more holistic way, and that you also manage to catch some moments of joy, of love, of everyday kind of mundane existence. That's quite beautiful as well. And I'm not really even sure if what my point is here, but just to acknowledge that that's a key part, you know, of the project, is not just to document the moments of injustice and to paint that picture, although it does exactly that. It is also about saying, you know, people are trying to live their lives through these crises points. So, you know, just like talking about
I
that.
want to say a little bit about it because yes, there is so much joy and laughter. Like I asked parents to describe their children. What were they like? What's their personality? To describe their home. Many people described their front patios and they had fruit trees. One of them, for example, talked about picking mangoes off the tree in their front yard by using a stick, and she said in Spanish, she said, mango caído, mango comido. As soon as the mango dropped, they would eat it. So there is so much joy and there's so much love and fight, like so how hard families tried to get their children back. And there's also one parent from Honduras. I asked him, do you think what happened to you was unjust? And he said, pues obvio, like obviously. And so like we had a laugh, we cracked up around that. So there is lots of joy and resilience and care and love in these stories. And that's another reason why oral history is such an important tool, because we focus on the person as a whole in interviews, not just the trauma they experienced.
Yes, thank you for that. Which is a good segue, I feel like, to talking about, tell us about what some of the future goals, future plans for the project are. And maybe, like how folks can keep learning and keep engaging with some of the narratives.
Something really cool that's happening now is that I created a WhatsApp group where I like joined all the families and they send me messages. I send them messages. I keep them updated on the legal processes, the lawsuit, for example, the settlement. And families have found each other in the US. Families are now reunified. Under the Biden administration, he created a task force to reunite families with their children and bring them to the US under a 3-year humanitarian parole. Families have started referring other families that they find in different parts of the country to the project to be interviewed. This past Saturday, I interviewed a dad. He was from Honduras, from the same town where I'm from. So that was really special. And so we're continuing to do interviews. We also want to plan for a book composed of the narratives from the oral histories, maybe a podcast, writing more articles that use quotes with the families' interviews. And but we need more funding. So please engage with the project. If you know of any grants that we can apply for, let us know, because I'm doing this part-time now. I've moved into other work, helping new immigrants apply for asylum. And so I'm continuing to do the project part-time, as most oral historians do. But that's the goal. There are many other outputs, formats that we can use.
I'm getting the sense, Ella, with your reappearance, that we are going to try to move things to the Q&A. Is that right?
Yeah, I know. This is such a really rich and powerful conversation. So I'm sorry to jump in now with our time constraint. And it's been, yeah, just everything you're sharing, Fanny, is really resonant. And there's been a lot of love in the chat if you haven't been able to see that. And I think it's such powerful work, and really want to yeah, like you highlighting the connections of the history of separation, I think is really powerful and gets at why this storytelling work is so important. So some people have been asking questions in the chat, which I can share now. Encourage folks to continue to message questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to them. If we can't get to all of them, we can follow up over email. But Rod Thorne asked if you had a therapist or any social services in the sessions with you, and would they have gone on camera if you could have done that? I don't know if that refers to the therapist or to the narrators, but that question about having a therapist or social worker there with you.
With me to conduct the interview? And for me or the narrator? Maybe they can respond to that in the chat. But for me, yes, I had a therapist. I needed one. It was hard to listen to these stories. For families back in their home countries, they didn't have a therapist, but I would ask them if they had a religious leader that they could speak to, or if they could speak with their families. When families were reunified, there's now, they were given access to resources where they could access therapy here in the States when they were reunified. And now the class action lawsuit, if you find it, if you put it in the chat, people can also look at it. The class action lawsuit provides for mental health for families who've been through officially from the government. The government will pay for it. Yeah. Sometimes I did interview people who had needed to have an attorney present. I did at least 5 interviews where I interviewed someone who had an open asylum case. And so the attorney wanted to be in the room just to make sure that we didn't touch into any area that could jeopardize their asylum claim.
Thanks,
And I
Fanny.
think just to add to that, Fanny and I have talked about this before and with other folks who do oral history work, but in the planning and budgeting for a project, think about having, money set aside to have
Yes.
someone on hand for your narrators and for yourself.
Yes.
Thank you, Fanny. And a question from, excuse me, from Eric is about if you could talk a little bit more about paying narrators, especially around having challenging conversations around how much is enough to pay, what if different interviewees might get different amounts. Yeah, just kind of how you navigate thinking about narrator compensation.
My colleague Nara Milanic and I wrote an academic journal article about everything that you're asking and how we came to the decision to pay narrators $100 per hour that we engaged with them. And the most that we paid one person was $400. And the least, I think it was like 150. Luckily, we had money from the Mellon Foundation through Barnard. Mellon Foundation didn't give the project money, but because my collaborator, Nara Milanic, teaches at Barnard, Mellon Foundation gave money to Barnard, and then we were able to access some of those funds to have funding to pay narrators. But the article goes into much more detail about all of our considerations, how much. For us, I would have wanted to give the families, $1,000, but we didn't have that kind of money. So we gave them what we could, but ostensibly, $400 for a family who's making $30 a week was substantial. One family, one mom told us that they used that money to build a new home because they were evicted from their land. So it helped in a small ways. Yeah.
Thank you, Fanny. And we'll be sharing that article that Fanny's talking about, as well as some other resources related to the project and a follow-up email that you'll be getting from Voice of Witness. I think you sort of alluded to this answer, Fanny, talking about your own experiences of having a therapist, but Laura asks, how do you all take care of yourselves so that you can continue to do this important work?
I am grateful for friends who let me talk hours on end about this project. Because it really helped to just talk about it. And that is one very small way where you can be present with somebody that's doing this kind of work. I just ask questions about it. And we're happy to tell you, and we promise we won't leave you in a state of sadness. We'll also share the good things about documenting these stories. But yeah, taking care of yourself. Dancing. I've started singing in the shower because that helps to do something fun. Creating joy for yourself is what I like to call it. Even if you don't have access to therapy, then creating joy in your body, in your mind, so that you can do this work is really important.
Yes, to more dancing, more singing anywhere, including the shower. I think this will be our last question for now, but Emily asked what technical tools were most helpful for you from recording to transcription?
Believe it or not, I used WhatsApp to communicate with families. That's an app that they were very comfortable using. I didn't want to send them something that they weren't comfortable with. So we continued communicating with WhatsApp. And because I was recording on my computer, basically, I did use voice memo app, which is already on most Macs. I use that to record the interview, and the sound quality is actually pretty great. And then I've learned some audio tools to tweak the sound to make sure there's no background noise. I could not control noise like a cow mooing in the background or chickens mooing in the background, but actually those kinds of sounds really helped me understand where narrators were. So sometimes when you're restricted, other doors open. So I think in oral history, we always have to consider the opportunities that having to pivot bring forth or bring to light.
Thanks, Fanny. I think we're gonna move to closing now. So I just want to give you, both of you, you and Dao, a chance to share any final words for us about the project or thoughts that have come up from this conversation.
I don't have anything like all encompassing, but one thing we didn't get a chance to talk about, which I think is so important, is one of the realizations that you had that's reflected in the logo for the project is that majority of the parents who've been separated are men.
Yes,
fathers. So to me, it's like eye-opening a little bit, because the mainstream view is that it's mostly women and children who are affected, and that ties into, I think, maybe a little bit of this idea of a perfect victim, or like the most relatable or worthy of our sympathies. And this project is also about like busting that open a little bit and saying, you know what, people don't have to be perfect victims or your ideal vision of who they should be. They are who they are, and this is their chance to, you know, say their piece and represent themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. We originally the parent figure in the logo was a mother holding a child, but most of the families or parents that were separated were fathers. And just think about it. If you have to send your child with somebody to another country, you're probably going to send it with the father, because fathers, males, gendered culture as it is, culture being gendered as it is, men are considered to have more authority. And so the fathers traveled with their children, and they are the most represented in the family separation statistics. And so we decided to make the parent figure androgynous, because it could be a mother or a father. And that brings me to something that I kind of want to close for everyone that's listening. When you hear stories about migration in the news media, ask questions. How are they being presented? Are they being presented as victims? Are they being shown in parallel to stories of human trafficking? Because another reason why fathers were targeted for separation is because they thought the child was being trafficked. But in many cases in the oral history that we interviewed with children, the children were part of the choice to migrate with the parent. And so they came of their own volition. They wanted to come to the US and they traveled. And so I think it's really important to ask questions when we see immigrant narratives in the media, and right now in this political election cycle, like how are immigrants being talked about is really important to ask ourselves. Thank you all for this opportunity. It's been so great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fanny, and for those closing words and for their this entire conversation. It's been incredibly powerful and such a strong reminder for all of us as we navigate this year, as we navigate being part of listening to these stories and acting in solidarity and acting in advocacy. So thank you so much, Fanny, for all the work that you do. Thank you to the narrators through you that we were able to hear their stories. Thank you to Dao for being part of this conversation, a partner in conversation. Thank you to the VOW team, especially our colleague Anaik, who's doing a lot behind the scenes. We'll be sending an email out that will have more information about about some of the links that we talked about, including the website for Separated, so that you can stay in touch with the project. If you enjoyed today's conversation, we hope that you'll join us for our next 2 oral history and practice webinars. We're going to be having one about celebrating Asian American music and memory on March 14th, and then one about storytelling with the Oral History Project Country Queers on April 17th. If you're an educator or interested in education, check out our Voice of Witness website to download free oral history resources and lesson plans. If you want to, work with us on a project, get support and a consultancy or some of our feedback, you can visit our website there at voiceofwitness.org/services, and always reach out to us with any questions. My email is there, L@voiceofwitness, and follow us on social media. If you want to learn more about different events and some of our new projects coming up, including our book coming out in June. But yeah, again, just want to say thank you so much to Fanny and to Dao for highlighting this really powerful, incredibly important project. And thank you to all of you today for joining us and for being part of this conversation. We really appreciate being in community with you. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.